Jack, do you want to send me the link?
Sorry, I just couldn't get it for what it should be there.
That's good. Do you want to do the screen share thing?
Yeah.
That's 5-2.
Yeah.
Jack, finish up sharing screen. Okay, welcome everyone to the Dinos, the Babies, WUDC training program debate to once and for all answer the age-old question whether age is just a number or it is indeed part of debating ability. On the judge.
I'll reduce the volume of our private chat.
No, okay. Good, and indeed the Dinos are once again unable to use technology correctly. As our judge today, we have the lovely Miriam, who's going to be chairing for everyone. So I'm going to pass over to her.
Hello, welcome everyone to this very fun debate. It's time to get started. It's my pleasure to call the Prime Minister to open today's debate. Here.
Yeah, so I can't turn on my video. Here we go. Now I can. Amazing. People need to see my glorious face. Okay. Right. And I can be heard pretty clearly, right? Yeah, cool. So I think it's worth starting off by thinking about what actually is at stake in this debate and what the differences really are. Because I think on both sides of the House, the EU is going to retain incredibly close ties with this new body for a whole host of reasons. The first is that there was a unique sense of expansionism at the point of like 2004 and so on after the fall of the Soviet Union, which meant that the EU probably wanted to expand to some extent or retain close ties with the countries that were formerly part of the USSR. And so they'll do that by, for example, forging trade ties with these countries. The second thing I would note is that the EU probably had residual feelings of guilt in the aftermath of maybe not preventing the Yugoslav war to the same extent. And so again, it probably has some degree of willingness to make up for that by providing aid and so on to these countries. And I think there's probably, last of all, some kind of economic reasoning, even from the perspective of the EU, for the reason that oftentimes these countries provide things like cheap labor and so on, which would reduce the price of things in the EU itself. I think the end point of all of this is that there are probably going to be strong economic ties and trade deals that exist on both sides of the House. And indeed, we see this in real life, where Serbia, for example, has a free trade agreement essentially with the EU, despite the fact that it's not actually a part of it. So all the kind of weird economic harms that might exist around are probably actually quite marginal. And the debate is very specifically then about whether or not it's better for these countries to essentially join the EU and probably give up a lot of their autonomy and so on, for the sake of maybe some marginal, more like direct handouts, or forming their own kind of confederation amongst themselves and kind of being able to have a lot more autonomy in terms of the crucial decisions around them. So what's the comparative in this debate then? I think that it's probably going to be, as I described, some kind of ASEAN-style agreement whereby these countries kind of come together and agree and have specific compromise on issues. So, for example, you can have a free trade agreement that exists within the region, but they also allow them to have a far greater degree of autonomy in terms of the things like foreign policy and so on, which wouldn't exist in a stronger union that exists in the form of the EU and so on. So I think the end point here is this probably going to retain a fair degree of collaboration both within these countries and with the EU, but obviously you aren't beholden to the same extent with EU decisions directly. I think this will have a number of implications that are quite positive overall. The first is purely economically. I think this is far better for these countries. The reason is incredibly simple. Oftentimes, EU policies and the way they're determined in places like the European Central Bank are primarily for the basis or the benefit for Western European countries like Germany and so on. The reason that these are the biggest economic players within the EU, they often make up the people who actually are in the ECB and so on. And so they're probably helpful for these groups. And what that means is that monetary policy is not specifically catered towards these countries themselves and what they might need in and of itself. And so you have things or have issues like, for example, the ECB having incredibly low rates, even though inflation in these countries.
Okay, on that point.
Right. No, I'll take it later. But also similarly, I think these countries like Germany and so on have an incentive to have an incredibly high value euro for the reason that they can then gain imports as a result of this. Whereas countries like Estonia and so on have an incentive to have weaker euro or weaker form of currency, because that then allows them to export cheaply to a far greater extent. So oftentimes their economic interests are incredibly harmed. And given they still have free trade on both sides anyway, it's kind of clear that economically these countries are worse off as a result. Before I go on to talk about like foreign policy impacts, yes, POI.
Do you realize only about 3 of these countries are part of the euro? The eurozone is not particularly relevant in this debate.
Yeah, but even if only a few of them are part of the euro, the increasing trend is that more and more of them are trying to join. So, for example, Croatia is about to join, or they have things like currency pegs to the euro, so they're still vulnerable to monetary policy anyway. That doesn't really make sense. Okay, second point then, as well, relating to foreign policy. I think on their side of the house, these countries retain far less of an ability to do things like play off Russia and Europe against each other, and indeed risk tensions, increase significant tensions with Russia as a whole. Because I think a lot of the fact that these countries have joined the EU has contributed to them being able to join NATO to a much larger extent, because the EU campaigns on their behalf to a large degree and so on. I think the difference now is when you don't join the EU, these countries have the option to join NATO or not. And I know that some of these countries retain quite strong historical ties to Russia and have a large degree of trade with them in the form of things like oil and gas and so on. So it is actually an important partner for at least some of these countries. The problem is when you join the EU en masse on their side of the house, which is what's happened, you are essentially forced to choose between having some support from Russia overall or having the EU on side, and you're essentially forced to abandon the latter. And I think that's incredibly harmful, both because Russia provides a lot of value to these countries in and of itself, but also obviously the idea of pissing off Russia, as we see, ends up being incredibly harmful for the reason that, you know, it's willing to engage in massive reprisals against you in the form of things like cyber attacks and so on, which end up being incredibly harmful as a result. The difference, though, is that when there's some kind of broader Balkan Union or whatever, specific countries, the ones that want to maybe retain ties with Russia, the one that Putin as well might see as closest to Russia in and of itself, can retain those close ties because they aren't forced essentially to toe the line that the EU wants, and so they don't risk the same extent of reprisal as a result. And similarly, the countries that maybe want to gravitate close towards the West are still able to do so by appealing to NATO on their own behalf and so on. So really, you essentially give these countries the opportunity to choose rather than lumping them in with one side and potentially forcing them to have a lot of reprisals and harms as a result. So given that then, essentially what you do on both these fields is give these countries a lot more autonomy, the capacity to decide essentially what's best for them and in terms of what they actually need as a result. And that's probably far better than the alternative of just essentially lumping them in and forcing them to, you know, devolve to like a kind of broader transnational kind of path. The last thing I want to talk about is that these countries have also eroded and weakened the EU itself. The reason is incredibly simple. Oftentimes when these countries have joined the EU and been able to engage in things like free movement and so on, that's actually harmed and increased Euroscepticism in Western Europe. Because oftentimes people from these countries try and move away to Western Europe and so on. And there's obviously massive right-wing sentiment that exists as a result of this. This led to things like Brexit, for example. I think it's very clear that Brexit is a direct result of these countries joining the EU, because this enabled politicians in the UK to weaponize this. This is incredibly significant for Europe as a whole, because it meant that, like, you know, one of its largest economies was essentially forced to leave. And I think that this also reduces EU legitimacy in general, because when it goes into crisis, there are traumatic incentives in terms of how you fund and responses to those crises in general. And I also think it does things like increase EU debt burdens, because the EU is essentially forced to give a bunch of handouts to these countries which might not be paid back. And also crucially, insofar as the most significant decisions in the EU require unanimity, these countries are then given a veto to those things, and so might even prevent the full functioning of the EU itself. At the end, then, I think this debate comes down to an incredibly simple thing. Should these countries be forced under the yoke of the EU permanently, even though they might have radically divergent incentives, or not, and be allowed to play them off against each other? I think the latter is very clearly preferable. Proud to propose.
I thank the speaker for that wonderful speech. And as I'd like to call upon the leader of opposition to open the case to their side.
Well, much to my relief, I don't think that PM actually rendered all debating pre-2015 actually obsolete. I'm going to talk about three things. Firstly, why in terms of economic development, this is massively beneficial to all countries involved. Oh, by the way, if my internet connection cuts off, just shout at me or something. Secondly, I'm going to talk to you why this facilitates political liberalization in many of these Eastern states, why that's hugely beneficial. And thirdly, broadly geopolitically, why we think a larger, more economically inclusive and powerful EU is to the benefit of the entire world. Before that, just some rebuttals, some of it will be integrated. The first thing we hear is that, well, in the absence of these countries joining the EU would have wanted to maintain strong relations anyway, so this is fairly marginal. Note a couple of problems with this. Number one, they just don't understand the magnitude of what it means to join the EU. It means giving the EU and the EU Commission in specific a whole host of directly coercive mechanisms, as they themselves are very keen to point out by talking about the loss of autonomy over your political structure, for instance, if you're backsliding in terms of democratic institutions, or if you, like Poland, are trying to crack down on LGBT and Jewish individuals, right? It means that you are not subject to the European Court of Human Rights or European Commission rules and regulations, or European law more generally if you're not part of the EU. They also just underestimate the magnitude of the actual economic aid here, right? Hungary and Poland, as of right now, have 200 billion euros worth of developmental aid pledged to them in various forms over the next 10 years. That's not something you would have gotten gratis from a bloc you didn't join. Thirdly, they say, like, I just don't think they account for the whims of political fate, right? Sure, maybe at the point at which they tried to join in 2014, the EU was broadly expansionist. As Brexit has shown, the political winds can easily change, right? The broader Western economic bloc could sour against the possibility of these countries joining if it's, let's say, a populist policy, if there's sort of racist sentiment towards people in these countries. So it's unclear that this close relation would have been forged to begin with. The second thing they say is that, well, you know, it's economically harmful for them to have joined. The first thing to point out is that the European Central Bank, like, ends up setting interest rate policy for these countries. This is absurd. Every country at a point at which it joins has the option of opting out of the euro. It is an explicitly optional policy. And the fact that the UK A did not join and B still left suggests that maybe, right, like there is some degree of inbuilt escape hatches to this entire system, right? Like countries, they think it's bad for them, can always opt in and out. And I suggest it's probably the case that the EU have quite a lot of flexibility as they currently exercise towards a large number of countries. Then they say a lot of decisions would be made by the big, powerful countries like Germany and the UK. I'll talk a bit later on, but why in general we think free trade is incredibly important for developing countries. But I just want to note in general that, again, as they point out, many of the key economic decisions in terms of economic strategy are made by consensus. If each of these countries has a veto, it seems bizarre to me to then suggest that most economic decision-making power lies with like Germany, France, or the UK. Then he said, well, you know, if you join the EU, you can't maintain good relations with Russia. I'm going to do an old-fashioned dino argument here, which takes the form, reality proves this is false. The fact that Germany aggressively pursued a policy of friendship through economic trade with Russia all the way until Russia actually invaded Ukraine suggests the absurdity of this argument. Not only was Nord Stream 1 actually happening, Nord Stream 2 was basically signed until Russia decided to charge into Ukraine anyway. Similarly, even right now, post the invasion of Ukraine, like Hungary is still aggressively deciding to buy more gas from Russia, despite what everyone else wants them to do. Again, the fact that they have a veto suggests this argument is nonsense. Also, the Baltics, for what it's worth, and Poland are virulently anti-Russia. They would have been virulently anti-Russia whether they were inside or outside the EU. That is a nonsense argument. So, firstly, let's talk about economic development. Some very basic facts are put out there on the table. These countries at the point at which they joined the EU were relatively poor for a number of reasons, but a large part of it was due to because of the fact that they were ex-USSR, for instance, or just happened not to have large colonial empires, right? Why is it crucial that they actually managed to access the free trade provisions of the EU? Number one, because the comparative is that they either formed a separate bloc, which is much poorer and therefore gives them a much smaller number of opportunities to either sell their own goods, which are able to produce relatively cheaply, being developing countries, or to buy more high-end goods from these other countries without the sort of tariff or protectionist barriers, right? That obviously is like a comparative worse. The second option is that they tried to sign free trade agreements with each individual EU countries or with the EU as a whole. The problem is that the EU in that case will have every incentive to put up protectionist barriers. Otherwise, they would literally just be in the EU, right? If there were no protectionist barriers at all. Or you would have to create a complex network, I'll take Ankit in a moment, of overlapping FTAs. But the problem is that each FTA you sign with one country has different standards from what an FTA you sign with any other country. So unlike joining the EU, where immediately all of your standards are immediately harmonized, giving you frictionless access to the largest economic bloc in the entire world, this would be far more painful and inefficient. Yeah, go for it.
Why won't the same forces that enabled and allowed these countries to join the EU in the first place also allow the EU to sign a long-term trade agreement with the new Balkan Union at that time?
Two responses. One is a sort of meta-debating argument. If you say they're just going to get all the benefits of the EU without joining the EU, you're basically conceding the case. The second argument is that once you join the EU, certain processes are placed in effect, which makes it very hard for you to withdraw from certain things you do not want to do. And that economic integration, as your economies become more and more aligned over time, means that you are more susceptible to EU centralization. I'll talk about why that's good in a moment. So firstly, like, we think the free trade benefits are obviously a lot greater. But also think about the sheer scale of the developmental aid, right? Once you're inside the EU has every incentive to make sure your economy actually develops, right? That's why there's $100 billion right now earmarked to help Poland with development as well as COVID-19. Thirdly, the free movement of labor and capital, which is something you only really get with the EU and nowhere else in the world in any other economic arrangement, massively benefits, right? The fact that investors are now able to come into countries which have higher projected GDP growth rates and invest in your economy. The fact that you're able to send your best and brightest overseas to study and come back with skills, or remit huge amounts, as Eastern Europeans currently do in the EU, is a benefit you don't get from any other ad hoc trade arrangement. Let's talk secondly about political liberalization. We think that it's incredibly important that countries which have tendencies towards autocracy and backsliding, like Hungary and Poland, with the eroding of democratic institutions, the free press, targeted attacks on minorities, are subject to the EU Court of Human Rights, as well as the coercive mechanisms which come with that, right? The best, and as the longer they're in the EU, the more coercive these mechanisms become, right? So the best example is how Poland was forced to scrap its disciplinary courts, for instance. Hungary was forced to stop its takeover of rural radio stations directly in response to the EU threatening to withhold development funding as a result of its general commitment to democratic principles, protection of minorities, there being a free press and an independent judiciary, right? Those are things which only happen when you are subject, as the prop concedes, to the coercive structures of the EU as they exist currently. For all these reasons, we think it's a fairly straightforward case, go with the prop.
I thank the speaker for a fantastic speech, and it's a pleasure to call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to take this aside.
Am I clearly audible? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Your voice in the chat. I'll talk to you about two things. First, I'll talk about political stability, and second, I'll talk about economic growth. First, on political stability. The first claim from opening opposition is that there are very direct coercive mechanisms over your sovereignty, and you are no longer subject to European law or the ECHR. We have two flips to this argument. Number one, coercive mechanisms within the EU in order to control these states substantially reduce on their side of the house. This is because countries like Hungary and Poland have significant influence over what European law is, precisely because they have leverage and bargaining power over the EU. I.e., the reason the EU got them inside is because they were worried that they might become spheres of influence for Russia, and therefore they are unlikely to do things like withhold development aid to these countries and will rather change EU standards, even as they apply to previously existing countries within the EU in order to become significantly less liberal. The second flip to this argument, though, is that it is on our side of the house that the EU has a lot more leverage over these states. The reason why is not giving development aid to these states by OG's own logic is potentially a threat to EU economies, meaning they are unlikely to ever do it. On our side of the house, in contrast, if you want these states to liberalize, you are able to do something like incorporate that into your trade deals because you have some negotiating power at the point where your economy is far less interconnected than them. For example, something like a small amount of economic underdevelopment in the state can lead to a flood of migration into your state on your side of the house, while it can't on our side, meaning EU countries are far more able to hold these countries accountable. I want to weigh this against our arguments on political liberalization. On their side of the house, states like Hungary and Poland have vastly worse institutions. All of Ashish's examples of Hungary undergoing democratic backsliding and therefore facing accountability from the EU is purely a reactive mechanism. Our claim is this democratic backsliding would not happen in the first place had Hungary not been in the EU. And this is how we flip all their arguments. Our claim is there is much stronger populism within states like Hungary that led to the election of people like Viktor Orban in a world where these states joined the EU. Why is this the case? The first reason is because liberal voters within these states are more likely to move to freer regions within the EU. In some cases, these are working class voters who disagree with corporate influenced policies of leaders like Orban and therefore move to places like the UK where they can get better economic opportunity, or like France or Germany. Or alternatively, these are voters who prefer liberal political institutions and hence move. This is an active political drain from these states that shapes who rules countries like Hungary. Second, a significant frame that Hungary uses in order to justify democratic backsliding is the notion that its sovereignty is deeply hurt by EU institutions because it can frame countries like Germany as having immense amounts of power within the EU and imposing regulations that simply dismisses as uniformity and standardization that increases economic efficiency a little bit, but also causes these states to feel like their sovereignty is being violated. This is used as an excuse to justify democratic backsliding within the state and the election of populists like Orban. Third, we also flip their claims about aid. Guess who disperses? No, thank you, EU aid. Orban's government. Aid is highly discretionary from the EU and often creates dependency within these states, by the way, because there are strong disincentives to engage in major liberalizing reforms if you're getting a constant flow of aid within these countries anyway, economic liberalizing reforms. What happens is they use this aid and use it to justify themselves and justify them staying in power at the point where their strong leverage over EU institutions means the EU continues to give them aid on their side of the house. The second thing, though, that we do on political stability is on their side of the house, Euroscepticism worsens. And this is where they address none of Ankit's arguments. Recognize that the primary function of the EU in terms of benefiting the world is doing things like accumulating refugees, putting in place environmental standards, and dispersing foreign aid to non-EU countries, for example, to developing countries. But in prominent EU states, for example, the UK, their policy vastly increases Euroscepticism. Recognize that countries like Poland and Romania are poorer, and a flood of Romanian immigrants into the UK is a strong political motivator to enable things like Brexit happening. That is what the political motivation is, to split from a union that was previously providing large states some degree of economic benefits because you don't want to stay at the point where migrants are flooding into your state. What this means is a large amount of the benefits that they claim the EU has, for example, the trade union, wither away. When large states like Italy also want to leave the EU in the future, that limits the ability of the EU to even provide the benefits of trade to these new Eastern European countries, while at the same time shutting out the ability of the EU to help other countries as well. Finally, on geopolitics, we didn't claim that you stop having relations with Russia and China. However, on our side of the house, you are much better able to negotiate your relationship with Russia and China in two distinct ways. One, because of tensions. On their side, there's a large amount of pressure to join NATO from the EU. And joining NATO for a lot of these countries is actively harmful because it causes Russia to try to exert subtle influence in a range of different ways. For example, engaging in things like information warfare within these states or engaging in cyber attacks in Estonia that vastly reduce their influence when they as a NATO adjacent threat. The alternative is not Russian invasion, and NATO will only intervene in Estonia in the event of Russian invasion due to things like political capital in the West. Russia has very limited incentives to invade Estonia at the point where it is focused on things like conflicts in Ukraine. The second is you're more able to negotiate with China. You're more likely to, for example, not be negotiated into BRI debt traps if you can form a coalescive bloc with a bunch of Eastern European states that are willing to join the BRI rather than richer states within the European Union who are less willing to participate in these negotiations. Second thing on economic effects. Their claim is that free trade is really important for these countries. What Aniket tells you is there are strong incentives to trade with these countries and give them economic aid on both sides of the house. Here are three of them. Number one, you want ties with countries that are near Russia in order to reduce the Russian and Chinese sphere of influence within these states. Second, you have access to cheap labor from these states. That is, it is more likely that you want to import things like manufactured goods that are much cheaper if they are manufactured in Romania than if they are manufactured in the EU, meaning you're likely to come up with EU joint trade agreements with them. Third, across developed countries, there are strong reasons to trade because of comparative advantage. That is, for example, a lot of richer EU states are switching away from manufacturing, e.g. Germany, famous for cars in the past, is switching towards services. And in order to do this, it needs to build a comparative advantage that involves trading with these smaller states. Now, they are right that you're less able to harmonize standards, but the harmonization of standards has a small cost on free trade. The much stronger political pressure for free state trade is to get things like goods and services that are much cheaper for you. I want to weigh this against their effects on economic development. The first is migration. They say there's free movement of labor and capital, but capital will move to these emerging markets anyway because richer EU states are already crowded with a lot of capital, so there's diminishing returns in investing with them. However, on their side, their remittance-based economies are bad because remittances do things like create dependence when there's migration shocks, while at the same time, skill leaves these countries to richer European states, making it harder for them to develop. But also, a lot of states are attempting to become part of the Eurozone. Countries like Estonia already are. And in these contexts, their export competitiveness with the rest of the non-EU world, which is the vast majority of global trade, is hurt at the point where Germany and France push the ECB to appreciate the euro at the expense of the prices of Estonian goods. Start to propose.
I thank that speaker for a wonderful speech, and it's supposed to call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition, if the science debate.
We used to take POIs. So a couple things in this speech. So firstly, let's look at the economic benefits, what Ashish gives you, we don't get sufficient response to. Secondly, let's look at political liberalization, the vast majority of their case. And finally, let's look at coercive external powers. Briefly on the economic advantages. The first thing I want to note here is their belief you get all the benefits of the EU, or next to all of them, without any kinds of constraints on your rulemaking, without actually being subject to lots of the kinds of EU rules they have a problem with, is farcical. All I would note is that's exactly what the UK tried to do after Brexit, much larger state, much larger economy, something which was unlikely to occur. But it is probably the case you get some of those benefits. Probably not as great as you had. Most EU states didn't worry about Russia until very recently. The comparative advantage which these states have probably isn't that great in comparison to most of the rest of the world. But let's look at the arguments which are exclusive to what changes as a result. Firstly, development aid. We say it's up to $100 billion over the next 10 years to Poland and similar amounts to Hungary. This is exclusive to our side, firstly, because they are more worried about the chaos and the more need for economic development of these countries. That is because you are part of the same market as them. If there is a shock in one place, that probably leads to bigger issues in other places and indeed a movement of labor from that. Their response to this is, well, look, that might not be good, so some of it's going to be wasted. It's definitely true, some of it's going to be wasted. But the EU does know this, and they do things like, for instance, demand strong rule of law. They demand that lots of these projects are hypothecated, so you know where the money is going and you end up auditing it. There simply isn't a reasonable argument on their side. But more than that, what is exclusive to our side is that we actually have pressure for these kinds of reforms from the very outset. What do we mean by that? For countries to have joined the European Union, they need to meet certain kinds of criteria. The Copenhagen criterion, access the acquis communautaire. That involves, for instance, guaranteeing you'll reduce the amount of state aid except in extreme cases. What does that mean? You have more competitive markets where you don't have the state supporting a handful of oligarchs, and in doing so, harming competition with the economy overall. That is something which is only likely when you have a supremacy of EU law. And it is true they might get some accession agreements. They will tend to be much smaller. And just note the impact here. We're talking about a bloc of countries, 1/12 of the size in terms of their economy compared to the rest of the EU. That is a huge shock and a huge benefit which we get. And even if you think they still get some of it, as Ashish notes, it's probably going to be much weaker than they otherwise think. But let's move on to their major issue, which is when they want to talk about political stability. The first thing we want to note on this is we don't think they respond much to our claim that you have to have all these reforms, but when you join the EU and when you remain in the EU, because kind of coercive measures are going to be in place. But they tell you a couple of things on this. Firstly, they say European law might exist, but lots of these decisions have unanimity, so you don't actually sanction them. Firstly, empirically untrue, exactly is what is being done on Poland and Hungary right now. But the reason is that while there are some areas where you need unanimity, in most areas you need supermajorities, because otherwise they're worried about exactly what Public Tejas would suggest. But let's even suggest it's true, that you need unanimity on all of these issues. Poland and Hungary, or states like that, can't veto in each of these cases because they often will be gaining from EU policy. They want some policies which benefit primarily them. And if you end up trying to veto all the policies which help another state because you want to show your power or annoy them, you will not get reforms which are beneficial to you. It is not good strategically for the states to be able to do this. Thus, their bargaining power is more limited than they think in the reality of how EU law works. But a second claim on this is, look, the only reasons why these countries backslide is because they are part of the EU, or the predominant one, if we're going to be fair. I'm not sure why that's the tipping point here. If you look at what Orban says, very little of it is anti-EU. Most of the Hungarians, most Poles would remain in the EU. It's instead anti-minority. If you look at Poland, it is about pro-religious values, not about anti-EU sentiment. I'm unclear why they think this makes such a big difference and is what is spurring the right. And it's worth noting that there isn't a movement in Poland to leave the European Union. About 85% of Poles still support remaining in the EU. And that should be intuitive. 100 billion euros of aid, the fact that they are able to move, are all big benefits for people in Poland. I just don't think they give you enough reason when it comes to why you would get this level of democratic backsliding. So it may be the case that this is a reason. I don't think it's a particularly strong reason. I think it might be overdetermined rather than underdetermined. But I think, if anything, the EU is probably useful at liberalizing them, particularly because the coercive instruments you can use. often what you're actually seeing isn't just racism, it is democratic backsliding in the values which are beneficial to the dominant party. Why is this the case? Because if you're a dominant party, you obviously want to erode democratic norms which can't be beneficial to you. Why does that actually matter in this case? Because that is when the European Union can actually intervene. They can threaten and actually can cut off funding. And that is beneficial. That is harmful to these states, partly because it's a lot of money, they are less developed, but partially because once they're integrated, you have more measures against them. Cutting off trade when you're strongly integrated with the EU is a much stronger coercive instrument than what they're talking about. The final claim they have is this leads to things like Brexit. I think it's probably true that this is one of the reasons for Brexit. I'll take you in a second. But if there's a choice of the UK remaining the EU or Poland, Hungary, and all these other states, because the benefit for all those other states is so much greater, I'm happy to make that trade-off. Go ahead, Tejas.
Even if cutting off trade is harder when you're within the union, we explained that when you're within the union, you cut off less trade. You're more willing to try to hold these countries accountable when you're not within the union. Compare this to all the minorities you're talking about, leading to other EU countries.
Right, but you have fewer coercive instruments. So yes, you may be more willing to do something, but there is less you can actually do. And as a result, you can do considerably more right now. And that's the point which we're saying, and that's the point we're having. So let's look at the weakening the EU and countries leaving. I think it's worth noting only one country has ever left. And yes, it is in part due to this anti-immigrant sentiment of people from Poland, Romania, etc. But the vast majority will always end up wanting to stay in. The reason is all the values which the EU gives them and seeing the chaos which Brexit has caused. So yes, maybe the UK leaves, but I don't think that follows which France is going to leave, Italy is going to leave. And indeed, in most of those countries since Brexit, you've had a shift more towards the center, people like Macron, and even in Italy with a weakening of the five-star movement. So I just don't think this is a very serious concern, given what's actually happening. The final thing I want to just talk about is geopolitical power. The first thing I just want to note on this is I think Russia is a false flag in this debate. Look, the Baltics wanted to join NATO because they were worried about Russia. They were formerly part of the USSR. Poland, which was part of the Eastern Bloc, was worried about Russia and worried about Russian aggression. I don't think that's very reasonable here. But the main claim, which we're going to say, is we think it is good the EU is able to stand up to them. If you believe all the Russian analysis, the end point of it is we should have fewer sanctions on Russia. But the key thing here is we often do want a more stable and stronger and larger EU. That is when you can fight Chinese influence. That's when you can fight Chinese influence, which is growing more and more and more, because that's when China doesn't have so much power. They can't say, here's some money, doesn't really matter. Here's some money with no countervailing force. And that's vitally important. So that's why Poland can reject Huawei and 5G investment. That is why you have less coercive power. And if anything, that means there's more freedom for all the states involved. It's for those reasons we're pretty pleased to oppose.
Hello, everyone. I am in a little bit of darkness here, but hopefully you can see me now as we discuss this debate. Thank you all for what was a really, really fascinating debate. Brief pause. Okay. Thank you all for what was a truly fascinating debate. We're going to discuss the clashes and why. But before that, I think the most important thing to note coming out of this debate is that Harish the Dino did pick up the current lingo of tipping point. So I think that is the most important takeaway that we have from this Dinos versus babies debate at this point. It's true. So I think in that sense, that's a moral win for the babies who've managed to push their lingo onto the Dinos. Other than that, I will go at the rationale. So this this debate, beyond the moral win, the debate infinitely less important when it does go to side opposition, which is to Dinos. Let's chat about why for. So effectively, we have here a few clashes. One is the question of the economic benefits to these continents. Second of all is on the question of the chances of the EU and the power within it in terms of the chances of its stability and other kinds of stability. Thirdly is the question of the relative power versus like Russia and other coercive powers. So let's chat about each one of those things. So in terms of the economic power, there's a lot of back and forth happening on the question of the free trade agreements that happen, etc. The free trade agreements that happen with these countries and the likelihood of whether they're still being formed. I do think that opening government or government in this case do manage to give me solid reasons why it is very likely that in fact they're that there's going to be very strong trade agreements, and a lot of those economic benefits are going to be instead on their side, given the strong incentives of the EU to have that kind of trade and movement of goods, etc. But I do think that what opposition points out and doesn't get a response from government is the fact that at the end of the day, these trade agreements, while the trade agreements may be reasonably similar, it is the massive incentive for really strong economic aid that comes out and is in billions to these countries is much more strongly on opposition side in the sense of the extent to which they're worried about a flood of immigrants or things along those lines, given the access to free movement of labor, means that it's far more likely that you're going to actually get massive aid to these countries, which is critically important for their ability to build up their infrastructure, etc., etc. The opposition pushback, even at the government pushback on this, is to potentially talk about the erosion of the EU, which I'm going to talk about in a second. But it's important to say that even if I were to accept the erosion of the EU to its largest amount, that still doesn't mean that there wasn't massive aid given at that time and throughout those entire years. And even if some countries leave the EU, that's not enough for me to believe that that massive aid will continue and development will happen. And therefore, we do think that there is going to be a lot more of that aid coming out on opposition side. Second of all, let's talk about the question of the liberalization and political stability. So here we think that what happens is that governments tell me that opposition that what's going to happen is that the aid is that countries are going to be able to erode EU mechanisms for liberalization, and furthermore that the reason that they are unliberal is because they have a strong pushback from the power and the coercive power of the EU, and that tomorrow it's going to be much easier for the EU to actually push back and ensure that they don't get to be able to push back and sanction them when they get undemocratic or etc. I think opposition both undermine the likelihood that there is a strong pushback against the sovereignty of the EU, given that there is already veto in there. Two, the likelihood that this is the main reason that the anti-liberal sentiment exists. And three, that even if there's a similar incentive, there's the similar power to push back against that anti-liberalization. And so I do think opposition do manage to prove to me that there is a stronger case for liberalization coming out on their side. Finally, when we talk about the question of being able to, when we talk about whether or not the EU is going to be eroded here, I do think that the question of whether or not there's going to, I do think that basically opening government managed to prove that this harms the EU's some extent and might push some countries out. The extent to which that matters in terms of what effect that has on the countries involved, to what extent or what impacts that causes is very, very minimal and therefore isn't quite strongly. Finally, in terms of fighting back against Russia, etc., I do think that opposition's claim that this is rather symmetric in terms of the incentives involved, the countries' desires to join NATO at that point in time to cause Russian backlash anyway, etc., is very, very minimal. And so at the end of the day, what I get is far, far more development aid, more liberalization coming out of position, and that is enough to put them. So I hope that was clear, despite the somewhat less than ideal audio. And thank you everyone for a wonderful debate.
All right, thanks everyone. And high takeaway and bye takeaway.
Thanks, everyone.
Red call.
Red call.